The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains of a run-down apartment in Philadelphia's outskirts. The room was small and cluttered, with stacks of unpaid bills teetering on the edge of the single wobbly table. Emily Brooks, 14, sat on the creaky wooden chair, her hands clutching a worn photo of her late parents. Her father's smile was frozen in time, his strong arms wrapped around Emily and her little brother Noah on a family camping trip 2 summers ago. A time when life was easier, safer, and full of laughter. Now, the apartment walls seemed to close in on her. The peeling paint revealed patches of mold, and the persistent dripping of the faucet in the tiny kitchenette was the only sound. Emily's stomach growled, but the last bit of food had gone to Noah the night before. She glanced toward the mattress on the floor, where 7-year-old Noah lay bundled in their only quilt. His breathing was labored, his cheeks flushed with fever. "Just hang in there, buddy," she whispered, brushing a strand of blonde hair from his damp forehead. Emily had spent the past 2 days searching for help. The local food pantry had already reached capacity, and the social worker she'd called had spoken about fostering options, words that struck fear into Emily's heart. She couldn't lose Noah, not after losing their parents in the car accident. She folded the photo carefully and placed it in her pocket, steeling herself. Today, she had one last chance. Across the street, a small grocery store was hiring part-time workers. She knew she was too young, but desperation overruled caution. The grocery store smelled of stale bread and cleaning supplies. Emily hesitated at the door, her nerves threatening to send her back to the apartment. The manager, a stout man with a receding hairline and sharp eyes, glanced up from the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone curt. I'm here about the job," Emily stammered. She tugged at the sleeves of her oversized sweatshirt, the fabric frayed from years of wear. The man raised an eyebrow. "How old are you?" 16, Emily lied quickly, trying to sound confident. He snorted. "Don't even bother. We can't take risks with underage workers. Liability issues." "But I can work hard. Please, I just need a chance," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "My brother is sick, and we don't have—" "I'm sorry, kid," he interrupted, shaking his head. "Try again in a couple of years." Defeated, Emily left the store, tears blurring her vision. She didn't notice the elderly woman sitting on the bench near the bus stop until she spoke. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, young lady." Emily stopped, startled. The woman's face was lined with age, her gray hair tucked neatly under a knit hat. Her eyes, however, were sharp and kind. I'm just trying to figure things out," Emily mumbled, wiping her face. The woman gestured for her to sit. "Sometimes it helps to talk. My name's Margaret." Emily hesitated, then sat down. Before she realized it, the whole story spilled out. The accident, the bills, Noah's fever, the rejection at the grocery store. Margaret listened silently, her expression unreadable. When Emily finished, she looked away, embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to unload all that." Margaret patted her hand gently. "It sounds like you've been through a lot. You're stronger than you think, you know." Emily shook her head. "Strength doesn't pay the rent." Margaret's lips twitched into a small smile. "No, but kindness might. Wait here." Before Emily could respond, Margaret stood and shuffled into the grocery store. Minutes later, she returned with 2 bags of groceries and handed them to Emily. "Take these," she said firmly, "and here." She pressed a folded bill into Emily's hand. Emily stared, overwhelmed. "I can't take this. I don't even know you." "Consider it a loan," Margaret said, "but I'll expect you to pay it forward someday." That night, Emily made soup for Noah using the groceries Margaret had given her. The boy's fever began to break, and for the first time in days, he managed a weak smile. "Where'd you get the food, Em?" he asked. "From an angel," she replied softly, brushing his hair back. As Noah drifted to sleep, Emily sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "You're stronger than you think." She didn't feel strong, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The morning air was crisp, biting at Emily's face as she hurried toward Margaret's community center. A faded sign above the door read, "Hope Haven Community Center." Despite its name, the place looked anything but hopeful. The paint was peeling, a few of the windows were cracked, and the building's exterior seemed to slump under the weight of years of neglect. Margaret stood at the front, her knit hat pulled snugly over her gray hair. She greeted Emily with a warm smile that contrasted with the dreary surroundings. "Good to see you, Emily," Margaret said, her voice cheerful. "I was starting to wonder if you'd show." Emily shifted awkwardly. "I'm not sure how much help I can be, but I'll try. That's all I ask." Margaret led Emily inside, where the air was cool and musty. A large, open room stretched before them, its wooden floors scuffed and its walls decorated with faded posters. Rows of folding chairs sat in one corner, while stacks of books and old toys cluttered another. "This place used to be the heart of the neighborhood," Margaret explained. "We ran after-school programs, food drives, even a job skills workshop. But after my husband passed, I couldn't keep it going on my own." Emily traced her fingers over a dusty shelf of books, imagining children laughing and learning in the space. It was hard to picture now, with the silence and the faint smell of mildew. "What do you need me to do?" Emily asked. Margaret's face brightened. "We'll start small. There's a lot to clean up, and I'm not as spry as I used to be. But first—" She reached into her pocket and handed Emily a folded paper. "I put together a list of local resources, food banks, medical clinics, even a group that helps with utility bills. I thought it might help you and Noah." Emily unfolded the paper and scanned the list. The names and numbers seemed like lifelines, but they also carried a sting of shame. She hated feeling like a charity case. "Thanks," she murmured, slipping the paper into her pocket. The hours passed as Emily swept, scrubbed, and organized. The work was tiring, but strangely satisfying. Margaret worked beside her, her movements slow but determined. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Emily," Margaret said as they sorted through a box of toys. "I can tell you're used to carrying a lot." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't really have a choice. After the accident, everything just fell apart." Margaret's eyes softened. "Life has a way of testing us, but you're stronger than you think." Emily had heard those words before, but this time they felt different, like they carried weight. She paused, holding a toy truck in her hands. "What made you start this place?" she asked, changing the subject. Margaret's smile turned wistful. "When my husband and I first moved here, we saw so many kids struggling. Parents working double shifts, kids getting into trouble. We wanted to create a place where they could feel safe, learn, and grow. For a while, it worked. But life, well, life has its own plans." Emily nodded, thinking about Noah. She wanted that kind of safety for him, a place where he could thrive instead of just survive. By the end of the day, the center looked a little less neglected. The floors were clean, and the clutter was sorted into piles, things to keep, donate, or throw away. Margaret handed Emily a sandwich and a bottle of water as they sat on the steps outside. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said. "You've given me hope again." Emily smiled faintly. "You've done a lot more for me." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Could the center really come back to life? Could it help her and Noah, and maybe even others in the neighborhood? As they locked up for the night, Margaret placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Come back tomorrow. There's more work to do, but I think you'll find it's worth it." That night, Emily returned to the apartment feeling lighter. The paper Margaret had given her sat on the table, and she stared at it for a long time before finally picking up her phone. She dialed the number for a local food bank and spoke to a kind woman who arranged for a delivery the next day. When she hung up, Noah's fevered voice drifted from the mattress. "What's going to happen to us, Em?" Emily knelt beside him, tucking the quilt around his small frame. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. "I don't know how yet, but we will." For the first time in weeks, she believed it. The next morning, Emily arrived at Hope Haven earlier than expected. The sun had barely risen, but she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts had been a restless swirl of possibilities and uncertainties. The center felt like a glimmer of hope, fragile but worth clinging to. Margaret was already there, her knit hat barely containing her silver hair. She waved warmly as Emily approached, her energy defying her age. "Morning, early bird," Margaret said, unlocking the center's front door. "Ready for another day?" Emily nodded. "What's first on the list?" Margaret handed her a clipboard. "We've got donations coming in from a local church. We'll sort through them and figure out what we can use here and what we can pass along to others." The donations arrived in a rickety van, driven by a cheerful man named Pastor Greg. His face was weathered but kind, his handshake firm. "Margaret tells me you've been a big help here," he said to Emily. "It's good to see young people stepping up." Emily felt her cheeks flush. "I'm just trying to help." As they unloaded boxes of clothes, canned goods, and school supplies, Emily's hands moved automatically, but her mind raced. These supplies could help so many people, including her and Noah. She wrestled with guilt at the thought. Margaret's words came back to her. Kindness might pay the rent. By noon, the center buzzed with life. Margaret had invited a few neighborhood families to come by for free supplies. Children laughed as they sifted through books and toys, while parents sorted clothes and thanked Margaret profusely. Emily worked quietly, helping wherever she was needed, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation of inadequacy. Would this be enough? Could these small acts of kindness really make a difference? In the corner of the room, Emily noticed a boy about her age rummaging through a box of clothes. His wiry frame and sharp, cautious eyes reminded her of a stray cat. He stuffed a jacket into his backpack when he thought no one was looking. "Hey," Emily said, stepping closer. The boy froze, his knuckles white against the fabric of the jacket. "I didn't do anything," he said defensively. "It's okay," Emily said gently. "If you need it, take it. But maybe don't sneak around. People here want to help." The boy narrowed his eyes but relaxed slightly. "Yeah, well, people always say that. Then they make you feel like crap for taking anything." Emily hesitated, recognizing the anger and shame in his voice. "I get it," she said. "But Margaret's not like that. Neither are the people here." The boy didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. He lingered by the toy box, pretending to inspect a model car. Margaret noticed and approached, her smile disarming. "What's your name, young man?" she asked. "Chris," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "Well, Chris," Margaret said, "we could use some strong hands around here. If you're willing to help, we can figure out how to repay you." Chris glanced at Emily, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, he set his backpack down and began sorting through a box of books. By the end of the day, Chris had warmed up enough to join Emily and Margaret for sandwiches on the front steps. The three of them watched the street, which seemed less grim in the soft glow of twilight. "So, you're really fixing this place up?" Chris asked between bites. "We're trying," Emily said. "Margaret's been working on it for a long time." Margaret chuckled. "This old place still has life in it, and so does this neighborhood. We just need to remind people of that." Chris didn't reply, but something in his expression softened. That night, Emily returned to the apartment to find Noah sitting up in bed, a bowl of soup in his lap. The delivery from the food bank had arrived while she was gone, thanks to Margaret's suggestion. Seeing Noah eating and smiling felt like a small victory. "I missed you today," he said, as she sat beside him. "I missed you too," Emily replied, ruffling his hair. "But I think we're on to something good." Noah's eyes brightened. "Really?" Emily nodded. "Really." The brisk autumn air smelled faintly of fallen leaves as Emily walked to Hope Haven the next morning. The streets of the neighborhood were quieter than usual, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a garbage truck. She pulled her oversized sweatshirt tighter against the chill, her mind buzzing with anticipation. When she arrived, Margaret was already there, as always. The older woman stood by the door, speaking with an unfamiliar man, a burly figure with a thick beard and a weathered baseball cap. His voice carried a gruff edge as he gestured toward the center's cracked windows. "You're really trying to bring this place back to life, huh?" the man asked skeptically. "That's the plan, Walter," Margaret replied with a calm smile. "And we could use your expertise." Walter grunted, crossing his arms. "I'm no miracle worker, you know. This place needs more than just a fresh coat of paint." "Which is why we need you," Margaret said. "You're the best handyman in the neighborhood, and you know it." Walter scratched his beard, glancing at Emily. "Who's the kid?" Emily hesitated, but Margaret stepped in. "This is Emily. She's been helping me with the center." Walter's gaze lingered for a moment before he sighed. "Fine. I'll take a look around, see what I can do. But no promises." Inside, the center buzzed with activity. A few volunteers had shown up, including Chris, who had reluctantly agreed to keep helping after Margaret's gentle encouragement. They worked to sort donations, clean the remaining clutter, and set up a small food pantry in the back room. As Emily carried a box of canned goods, she overheard two women near the front door whispering, "Why's Margaret wasting time on this place? It's been dead for years," one woman said. "And who's that girl? She's just a kid." "What can she do?" the other replied. Emily's hands tightened on the box. She wasn't sure why their words stung so much, but they did. She kept her head down and walked to the pantry, where Chris was stacking shelves. "Hey," Chris said, glancing up. "You okay?" "Yeah, fine," Emily muttered, setting the box down. "Just tired." Chris raised an eyebrow but didn't press her. Instead, he handed her a can of soup. "Help me stack these?" As they worked, Emily found herself calming down. Chris's steady presence was strangely reassuring, even though he rarely talked about himself. She was beginning to understand why Margaret had a way of drawing people in, even those who didn't realize they needed help. By midday, Walter had inspected the center and delivered his verdict. It needed new windows, fresh paint, and serious repairs to the plumbing. "It's not hopeless," he said, "but it's gonna take money." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll raise it." Walter laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Good luck with that." "We've done it before," Margaret said, "and we'll do it again. The people in this neighborhood care more than you think." Over the next few weeks, Margaret's words were put to the test. She and Emily began organizing small fundraisers, bake sales, raffles, and even a car wash in the grocery store parking lot. At first, the response was lukewarm. Many people were skeptical, unwilling to believe the center could make a difference after being dormant for so long. But gradually, something began to shift. Parents who had once brought their children to Hope Haven started to reminisce about the programs that had helped them. Older kids, now young adults, came back with stories of how the center had kept them off the streets. Slowly, the neighborhood began to rally. Chatu? One chilly Saturday morning, Emily stood at a bake sale table outside the local church. She wore an oversized scarf to keep warm as she handed out cookies and collected donations. Noah sat beside her, bundled in his puffy jacket and grinning as he sold brownies to passers-by. $2 for a brownie?" a gruff voice said. Emily looked up to see Walter, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. "They're really good brownies," Noah said seriously. "My sister made them." Walter chuckled and handed over a $5 bill. "Keep the change." Emily smiled, her chest warming despite the cold. "Thanks, Walter." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I'm still not convinced this place is worth the effort." "We'll prove it to you," Emily replied, her voice steady. Walter gave her a long look before nodding. "We'll see." By the end of the day, the bake sale had raised over $300. It wasn't enough to cover all the repairs, but it was a start. That evening, Emily sat with Margaret in the center's main room, counting the money and making plans. "You're good at this, you know," Margaret said, glancing at Emily. "At what?" "Bringing people together, giving them hope." Emily shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I'm just trying to help." "That's how it starts," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. "And before you know it, you're leading the charge." As the weeks turned into months, Hope Haven began to transform. The windows were replaced, the walls were painted, and the plumbing, thanks to Walter's reluctant but skilled hands, was finally fixed. The center wasn't perfect, but it was functional. And more importantly, it was alive. Emily felt a growing sense of purpose as she worked alongside Margaret, Chris, and the other volunteers. The whispers of doubt from the neighborhood began to fade, replaced by cautious optimism. One evening, as she walked Noah home from school, he tugged on her sleeve. "Are we gonna be okay now?" he asked. Emily looked down at him, his wide eyes filled with hope and uncertainty. She thought about the progress they'd made, the people who had come together to help, and the future she was starting to believe in. "Yeah," she said, squeezing his hand. "I think we are." Winter had settled over the neighborhood, blanketing the streets in frost and painting the windows of Hope Haven with delicate patterns of ice. Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Children laughed in the corner as they played with donated toys, while a group of parents huddled near the food pantry, exchanging stories and recipes. Emily stood by the small desk near the entrance, helping Margaret sort through paperwork. "This is what I dreamed of," Margaret said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "A place where people feel safe again." Emily smiled, glancing around. The once dilapidated center had become a beacon of hope. But even as she felt pride in what they had accomplished, a faint unease lingered in her chest. It was as though the stability they had fought so hard to build was precariously balanced, one strong gust away from toppling. The gust came that afternoon. The first sign of trouble was a letter addressed to Hope Haven. Margaret read it aloud, her brow furrowing. "Notice of property reassessment. Increased tax valuation," she murmured, trailing off as she scanned the page. Her face fell. "What does it mean?" Emily asked. Margaret sighed, placing the letter on the desk. "It means our property taxes are going up, way up, more than we budgeted for." "How much more?" Margaret hesitated, then turned the letter toward Emily. The number at the bottom made her stomach drop. $3,500. "That's impossible," Emily said. "We don't have that kind of money." "I know," Margaret said softly, "but we'll figure something out. We always do." That evening, Emily walked home with Noah, her thoughts racing. Margaret's calm reassurances hadn't eased the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The center had become a lifeline not just for the community, but for her and Noah. If they lost it now, where would they go? What would they do? "Emily?" Noah's small voice broke through her thoughts. "Yeah, buddy? Are you okay?" he asked, looking up at her with wide, concerned eyes. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, just thinking about grown-up stuff." "Is it about the center?" Noah asked. "You've been working there a lot." Emily hesitated. "Yeah, but it's nothing you need to worry about. We'll figure it out." Noah nodded, but his expression didn't lighten. Emily hated how much he understood for his age. She wished he could have the carefree childhood he deserved, but life had demanded too much from both of them. And the next day, Margaret called a meeting at the center to discuss the tax issue. Walter, Chris, and a few other volunteers gathered in the main room, their faces tense. "We need to come up with $3,500 by the end of next month," Margaret explained. "If we don't, the center could be shut down." Chris frowned. "How are we supposed to raise that much? The fundraisers have been good, but nothing close to that." Walter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I warned you about this. Fixing the place up is one thing, but keeping it running, that's a whole other battle." "We've faced tough odds before," Margaret said, "and we've always found a way." Emily listened, her hands clenched in her lap. The room buzzed with suggestions: another bake sale, asking local businesses for donations, even a raffle. But none of them seemed like enough. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, threatening to smother her. Finally, she spoke. "What about grants or sponsorships? There have to be programs that help places like this." Margaret nodded. "That's a good idea, but grants take time to apply for, and even longer to approve. We need something faster." The room fell silent. Over the next week, Emily threw herself into the problem. She stayed late at the center, researching grants and drafting letters to potential donors. Margaret helped where she could, but the strain of the situation was beginning to show. Even Walter, gruff as ever, offered to donate some of his earnings from handyman jobs. Still, progress was slow, and Emily's anxiety grew with each passing day. One evening, after hours of work, she leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. "Am I even doing this right?" she muttered to herself. "You're doing more than anyone else." Chris's voice came from the doorway. He walked in, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Don't be so hard on yourself," Emily sighed. "It just feels like no matter how much I do, it's never enough." Chris sat down across from her. "You're not the only one fighting for this place. We're all in it together." Emily looked at him, surprised by his sincerity. Chris had always kept his walls up, but lately he seemed more invested in the center, and in her. "Thanks," she said quietly. "That helps." Chris shrugged, but the faint smile on his face said more than his words. 2 weeks before the tax deadline, Emily got a call from Margaret late at night. "I've got good news and bad news," Margaret said. "The good news is, I found an old friend who's willing to cover part of the taxes. The bad news is, it's not enough." "How much are we still short?" Emily asked, bracing herself. $200, Margaret replied. "I know it's a lot, but we've come so far. I don't want to give up now." "We won't," Emily said firmly. "We'll figure it out." That weekend, the community came together for a last-ditch fundraiser, a block party outside the center. Tables were set up with baked goods, crafts, and raffle tickets. A local band volunteered to play, drawing a small but enthusiastic crowd. As Emily worked the raffle table, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The neighborhood was showing up, supporting each other in a way she hadn't seen before. For the first time, it felt like they might actually make it. By the end of the night, they had raised nearly $900. It wasn't quite enough, but it was close. Margaret hugged Emily tightly, tears in her eyes. "You've done so much," she said. "I'm proud of you." Emily smiled, though the weight of the remaining $300 lingered in her mind. The final $300 came from an unexpected source. On the morning of the tax deadline, Walter arrived at the center with an envelope. "What's this?" Margaret asked. "Part of my savings," Walter said gruffly. "Don't make a big deal out of it." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the envelope. "Thank you, Walter." Walter waved her off. "Just keep this place running." As Margaret paid the taxes that afternoon, Emily felt a profound sense of relief. They had done it, together. The community had risen to the challenge, proving that even in the face of adversity, they could overcome. That evening, as she walked home with Noah, the frost-covered streets didn't feel so cold. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Emily felt like they were building something that could last. Winter had deepened its grip on the neighborhood. The streets were coated in a thin layer of ice, and a biting wind carried the promise of snow. Hope Haven had weathered the storm of its property taxes, but Emily knew that the fight to keep the center alive was far from over. The community had rallied, but their fragile stability depended on constant vigilance. Yet for the first time in months, Emily allowed herself a moment of pride. She had helped bring the center back to life, and she had done it alongside people she had come to trust. People like Margaret, Chris, and even Walter, whose gruff exterior hid a heart of gold. But as Emily stepped into the center that morning, a strange stillness greeted her. Margaret wasn't at the front desk, and the cheerful hum of activity was missing. She set down her backpack and called out, "Margaret, are you here?" A shuffling noise came from the small office in the back. Emily hurried over to find Margaret seated at her desk, her face pale and drawn. "Margaret!" Emily exclaimed. "What's wrong?" Margaret waved her hand weakly. "Just a little under the weather, dear. Nothing to worry about." But Emily could see the strain in Margaret's posture and the unnatural flush on her cheeks. She placed a hand on Margaret's forehead, just as she had done for Noah during his fever. It was burning hot. "You're not just under the weather," Emily said firmly. "You're sick." "It's just a cold," Margaret protested. "There's too much to do for me to stay home." Emily crossed her arms, her resolve hardening. "You're not staying here. You need rest, and maybe a doctor." Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I can't afford a doctor, Emily, and I don't have anyone to look after me." "You have me," Emily said, "and Chris, and everyone else who owes you for what you've done here." Margaret smiled faintly. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" "Must have learned it from you," Emily shot back. That afternoon, Emily enlisted Chris's help to close the center early and walk Margaret home. Margaret's apartment was as modest as Emily had imagined, a cozy, cluttered space filled with photos and knickknacks. As they helped her settle onto the couch, Emily noticed a framed picture of a man with kind eyes and a broad smile. Margaret caught her looking and smiled wistfully. "That's my Harold," Margaret said. "He passed a few years ago. We built this center together." Emily sat down beside her. "He'd be proud of what you've done, of what you're still doing." Margaret squeezed her hand. "Thank you, dear." Chris returned from the kitchen with a glass of water and a blanket. "You should get some sleep," he said gruffly. "We'll make sure everything's handled at the center." Margaret looked between the two of them, her expression softening. "I don't know what I'd do without you kids." "You'll never have to find out," Emily said, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. Over the next few days, Emily juggled her responsibilities at the center and at home while checking in on Margaret every evening. With Chris's help, they kept the center running smoothly, though it was clear to Emily how much Margaret's absence was felt. Parents and kids alike asked after her, and Emily realized just how deeply Margaret's kindness had impacted the community. One evening, while Margaret dozed on her couch, Emily took it upon herself to tidy up the apartment. As she sorted through old papers on the dining table, she found a stack of unopened medical bills. Her heart sank as she realized the extent of Margaret's struggles. Chris arrived shortly after, with soup and bread from a local deli. When Emily showed him the bills, his jaw tightened. "She didn't tell anyone about this," he said. "Of course she didn't. She's too proud." "We have to help her," Emily said. "She's done so much for all of us. We owe her." Chris nodded. "But how? She'd never let us pay her bills outright." Emily thought for a moment, then smiled. "We won't tell her." The next day, Emily and Chris quietly rallied the community. They explained Margaret's situation to a few trusted volunteers, who immediately offered to help. Walter agreed to fix the broken radiator in Margaret's apartment for free, and one of the parents at the center, an accountant, offered to negotiate with the hospital to reduce Margaret's bills. Emily and Chris organized a surprise fundraiser, a Thank You Margaret event at the center. Families brought baked goods, handmade crafts, and even small cash donations. Kids made cards and decorations, turning the center into a celebration of the woman who had brought them all together. When Margaret finally returned to the center, still pale but smiling, she was met with a round of applause. Tears filled her eyes as she took in the sight of the decorated room, the smiling faces, and the outpouring of gratitude. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "It's for you," Emily said, stepping forward, "for everything you've done for us." Chris handed Margaret an envelope. "It's not everything, but it'll help with the bills." Margaret opened the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was a check from the fundraiser, along with a note detailing the efforts of the community to support her. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to say anything," Emily said, hugging her. "You've always been there for us. Now it's our turn to be there for you." That night, after the event, Margaret sat with Emily and Chris in the quiet center. The three of them shared a pot of tea, the warmth of the moment chasing away the winter chill. "You kids are something special," Margaret said. "You give me hope for the future." "You taught us how," Emily replied softly. Margaret smiled, reaching for Emily's hand. "The world could use more people like you. Keep building bridges, Emily. They'll take you farther than you think." Emily didn't fully understand Margaret's words at the time, but they stayed with her, lighting a fire in her heart. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was building something that could last. Spring crept into the neighborhood slowly, the frost retreating and giving way to budding leaves and warmer winds. The renewal of the season mirrored the energy at Hope Haven. The fundraiser for Margaret had done more than help her with medical bills. It had deepened the bonds among the volunteers and the families who relied on the center. Emily felt it in the smiles of the kids playing after school, the parents who now lingered to chat with each other, and the increased presence of new faces curious about the programs. But with growth came challenges, and Emily was beginning to realize how much work it took to keep everything running smoothly. One Wednesday afternoon, Emily sat at the desk in the back office, surrounded by stacks of papers. Grant applications, schedules for volunteers, and a list of needed repairs cluttered the small workspace. Chris leaned against the doorframe, munching on an apple. "You're gonna burn out, you know," he said. Emily sighed, rubbing her eyes. "Someone has to keep this place together." "That's why there's a team," Chris pointed out. "You can't do it all." "I know," Emily replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just, Margaret's still recovering, and there's so much we could be doing. Look at this." She held up a flyer for a literacy program she wanted to start. "If we had more books, more volunteers." "Then get them," Chris interrupted. "You're already doing the impossible, Em. Maybe it's time to ask for more help." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. Chris had a point. The center had grown beyond its original scope, and it wasn't just Margaret and Emily running it anymore. They had a network of people who cared, people who wanted to see it succeed. That weekend, Emily organized a meeting with the volunteers to discuss expanding the center's reach. Walter, Chris, and a dozen others gathered in the main room, sitting on mismatched chairs and benches. "We've come a long way," Emily began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "But there's still so much we can do. I've been looking into new programs, things like tutoring, job training, and more activities for kids. But to do that, we need resources, books, supplies, and maybe even partnerships with local businesses." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. One of the parents, a woman named Carla, raised her hand. "My sister works at the library downtown," Carla said. "I bet she could help with books." Another volunteer, a retired teacher named Mr. Harris, chimed in. "I'd be happy to run a tutoring program. I've got experience, and I know a few other retired educators who might want to help." Emily's heart lifted as more ideas poured in. By the end of the meeting, they had a plan. Organize a community open house to showcase Hope Haven and attract more support. The open house was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the preparation was daunting. Emily coordinated with volunteers, created flyers, and even convinced a local bakery to donate cookies and pastries for the event. Margaret, though still recovering, helped with planning from the sidelines, offering sage advice and occasional reality checks. But a week before the open house, disaster struck. A pipe burst in the center's bathroom, flooding part of the main room and damaging the recently painted walls. Emily stared at the mess in dismay, her shoulders slumping under the weight of yet another obstacle. "We can't cancel," Emily said, pacing as Walter inspected the damage. "This is too important." Walter grunted, his toolbox in hand. "No one said anything about canceling. We'll get it fixed." "But what about the walls?" Emily asked. "It'll take days to repaint." "Then we repaint," Chris said firmly. "You're not doing this alone, remember?" Emily blinked, the frustration in her chest loosening slightly. Chris and Walter got to work on the pipes, while other volunteers rallied to clean up the mess. By the end of the week, the bathroom was functional again, and the walls were freshly painted. The day of the open house dawned sunny and warm, a perfect backdrop for the event. Emily arrived early to set up, her nerves jangling with anticipation. Tables were arranged with information about the center's programs, and a small stage was set up for kids to perform songs and skits. By noon, families began trickling in, followed by local business owners, city council members, and even the librarian Carla had mentioned. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, the once dilapidated space now brimming with life. Emily stood by the entrance, greeting visitors and answering questions. A man in a suit approached her, introducing himself as Mr. Carter, a representative from a local nonprofit. "We've been hearing great things about Hope Haven," Mr. Carter said. "Your work here is inspiring. Have you considered applying for a grant with us?" Emily's breath caught. "I've looked into it, but I wasn't sure we'd qualify." "You absolutely qualify," he said, handing her his card. "Let's set up a meeting next week." As the open house wound down, Emily stood outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Chris joined her, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. "You did it," he said, nudging her shoulder. "We did it," Emily corrected, a smile tugging at her lips. Margaret walked out to join them, leaning on her cane. "This is what I always hoped for," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "A place that brings people together." Emily looked at the glowing windows of the center, the laughter of children still echoing inside. For the first time, she felt a deep sense of peace. The obstacles they had faced had only made them stronger, and the future felt brighter than ever. The early summer sun streamed through the windows of Hope Haven, casting warm light across the bustling main room. The center was alive with activity, children laughing as they played board games in one corner, parents chatting over cups of coffee, and a group of teenagers assembling care packages for a local shelter. The air hummed with purpose, a testament to how far they had come. Emily stood by the entrance, her clipboard in hand, watching it all unfold. A sense of pride swelled in her chest. It had been over a year since she first walked through these doors with Margaret, unsure if the center could ever regain its former glory. Now, Hope Haven was more than a community center. It was a lifeline, a second home for so many. "Emily?" Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts. Emily turned to see Margaret approaching, her cane tapping lightly on the floor. Though still frail, Margaret's eyes were bright, her smile as warm as ever. "You've outdone yourself, dear," Margaret said, her voice tinged with awe. "This place is thriving," Emily grinned. "I had good teachers." Reflections on the journey. That evening, after the center had closed for the day, Emily and Margaret sat on the front steps, sipping lemonade and watching the sunset. The street was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of passing cars. "Do you remember the first time you walked in here?" Margaret asked. Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I was terrified. I didn't think I could do anything to help." "And now?" Margaret prompted. Emily looked at the center, its windows glowing softly in the twilight. "Now, I know that even the smallest actions can make a difference, and that when people come together, they can do incredible things." Margaret reached over, patting Emily's hand. "You've learned something. It takes most people a lifetime to figure out. You've built more than a center here. You've built a community." New horizons. The next week brought exciting news. Emily had been invited to present Hope Haven's story at a local nonprofit conference, alongside Margaret. It was an opportunity to share their journey and potentially secure additional funding to expand their programs. Chris teased her mercilessly as she prepared. "Don't trip on stage," he joked, leaning against the doorway of the office. "I'll try my best," Emily shot back, rolling her eyes. "But if I do, you can explain it to the audience." Chris smirked. "Deal." When the day of the conference arrived, Emily stood on the stage, her nerves fluttering as she faced the crowd. But as she began to speak about Margaret's vision, the struggles they had overcome, and the lives they had touched, her confidence grew. By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet, applauding. Margaret beamed from her seat in the front row, her pride shining as brightly as the lights overhead. A bright future months passed, and the center continued to grow. The grant they had secured from Mr. Carter's nonprofit allowed them to add new programs, including a computer lab for job training and after-school tutoring sessions. Emily, now 16, found herself juggling more responsibilities than ever. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she thrived. She had learned to delegate, to trust the team around her, and to embrace the challenges that came with leadership. Noah, now 9, often came to the center after school, his laughter echoing through the halls. He had started drawing pictures of buildings. His dream was to become an architect someday. Emily couldn't help but smile every time he showed her a new design, knowing that Hope Haven had given him the stability and inspiration to dream again. Legacy and growth. One sunny afternoon, Emily walked through the neighborhood, delivering flyers for an upcoming block party hosted by the center. She stopped by Walter's workshop, where he was repairing a broken chair. "Still keeping busy?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Walter grunted. "Some of us don't get summer vacations." Emily chuckled. "The center wouldn't be the same without you, you know." Walter looked up, his expression softening. "You've done good, kid. Real good." Emily smiled. "Thanks, Walter. That means a lot." Passing the torch. By the time Emily turned 18, the center had become a cornerstone of the community. Margaret, now in her late 70s, decided it was time to step back from her day-to-day involvement. "You're ready, Emily," she said one evening, as they sat in the office together. "You've been ready for a while. It's your turn to lead." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. "I don't know if I can fill your shoes." "You don't need to," Margaret replied. "You've already made your own path. Just keep walking it." Building something that lasts. Years later, Emily stood outside Hope Haven, now a fully renovated and thriving community center. The faded sign had been replaced with a bright new one, and the building itself stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. Noah, now a teenager, stood beside her, holding a stack of architectural sketches for a new wing they planned to add to the center. "You think we can really pull this off?" he asked. Emily smiled, her eyes glinting with determination. We've pulled off harder things. As the sun set, casting golden light over the neighborhood, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been hard, filled with setbacks and uncertainties, but it had also been transformative. Together, they had built something that would endure, something that would continue to inspire and uplift for generations to come. Sometimes, all it took to build something lasting was a little kindness, a lot of determination, and the strength to keep going, no matter how difficult the road ahead.